so this course is really an extension of our first year algebra course. And all these things that I'm going to be doing right now aren't really anything that you necessarily need to take active notes on. You can just kind of sit and relax. Mostly what we're talking about is prior learning. Anything that would be relevant to this course that I do kind of touch on today, I would plan on going through in much greater detail later on when it's time to actually get into the nuts and bolts of this course. But I just want to get a little idea of what you guys do remember doing in Algebra 1 and the kind of skills that you practice during that Algebra 1 course. So I'm going to ask for some volunteers of people to just kind of tell me some of the kinds of things you remember doing in your Algebra 1 course, or topics you remember covering, or kinds of problems that you remember doing. Anyone at all, just shout them out if you can think of something. Michael. Okay, so you're talking about writing the equation for a line, would be kind of what that sounds like? Or graphing, okay. So I wrote down two things there based on Michael saying y equals mx plus b. So probably you spent some time writing the equation for a line. So given 2 points or a point and a slope, you wrote a y equals mx plus b equation to represent the line that passes through those 2 points, or a line with the given slope that passes through that single point. And you probably spent time graphing lines that were in slope-intercept equation. So if I gave you y equals 3x plus 7, you would plot some points and draw the line that connects those points. That sounds very much like an Algebra 1 skill that I would have expected that you spent a lot of time doing. Probably even, like first semester I would expect that to be the biggest skill that you probably remember doing, is writing equations for lines and graphing lines. Is very much a first semester Algebra 1 topic. Someone else with something they kind of remember. Yes. Yeah. And probably mostly when we say solve for x, you're talking about a linear equation. In Algebra 1, like 7 plus 3x equals 10 or something. So things that look similar to this. That's good. So I would expect that everyone would have had a lot of practice solving a linear equation. Does anyone remember solving like an absolute value equation in their Algebra 1 course? Some people nodding. My expectation here would be that maybe half of us remember spending time during their Algebra 1 course solving absolute value equations. That's a topic that we would at least go over, probably not with the same depth as I would expecting we start from 0 on, but would be something we'd certainly talk about in this course and during the first semester. Do we remember solving quadratic equations? Again, that's probably a 50-50 proposition. I would expect some of us to have experience with that, but that's a skill that is probably a fundamental skill the first semester of this course, and we will spend a lot of time talking about the different ways to deal with quadratics and quadratic equations, because it becomes a very important sub-skill for many of our second semester topics. So it's something that I need to make sure that we can do quite well, as it's probably the skill coming out of this course that will be the most important going forward. So it's a skill that you need to be able to do in future math courses. So we will spend a lot of time first semester devoted to solving quadratics and the different ways to solve quadratics, and quadratics in general will be the main theme during first semester. It won't be the only topic, but it will be the most time will be spent inside of that topic. What else do we remember? Foiling, good. So FOIL is an acronym. Probably most of us are familiar with this, but FOIL describes the method you would use to multiply two binomials together. It stands for the words first, outer, inner, last, just describing how you do the multiplication. There's another F word commonly associated with FOIL. Factoring. That's the F word I was thinking about, not the other one, you naughty students. I was trying to make a joke. You know, like the F word is common reference to like a swear word that we probably shouldn't be using in a Catholic school. I was making a joke that when I said another F word that you were thinking about swear words and not math words. Not factoring, right. But factoring was what I was hoping you were to say, not what I thought you'd be thinking of, according to the joke. Great. So factoring, again, my expectation is that probably some of us have done a little bit of factoring of quadratics. This is, along with the solving of quadratics, and really this is a skill that you can use as part of a solving of quadratics process. Tremendously important skill for first semester. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about factoring. And there will be certain kinds of factoring that the expectation is that you will be able to do quickly without writing anything down with a high degree of accuracy. So we'll talk about like the kind of factoring that I would expect you to be able to do quickly, accurately, just kind of in your head, and the kinds of factoring that I would expect you to be able to do, but probably would need to write some steps down in order to do. More so when we get there. If you haven't done any factoring at all, or you don't recognize that command term, that's okay. We will start with factoring and with the assumption that really nobody has done this before, and start from the ground floor. So even if you've seen this before, I'll hopefully add some depth so you understand a little bit better what this process is doing. Even if you're familiar with like the how to do it, the little bit of what it's doing, maybe I can add some understanding there, even if you've done this skill many times before. Foiling is something that I expect most of us have done and are fairly comfortable with. Other stuff. There's another major command term that I'm surprised nobody's said yet. It's another S word. Well, I mean, that's not what I was expecting, but that is absolutely an S word that is a relevant Algebra 1 topic. So certainly I would expect everyone to have spent time calculating slopes in their Algebra 1 class, and you probably spent a good amount of time last year in geometry calculating some slopes. So that's a skill that I would expect we're probably pretty familiar with and pretty good at, or comfortable with anyways. There's another S word that's kind of a command term. By a command term, it would be like an instruction to a kind of problem. Subtract wasn't what? What did... Simplify was the one I was looking at. By simplify, what we mean is combining algebraic terms using addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division. So if I have like 5x squared plus 7x squared minus 6x cubed plus x or something, and I ask you to simplify that, what that really means. We're really just kind of talking about combining like terms. But the rules on how we do that with with each of the 4 fundamental operations, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, are a little bit different. But that's a skill I would have expected most of us to have seen a lot of already. Now we might have to rehash like when the exponent changes and when the coefficient changes when you're doing that combining. But I would expect that to be something we're pretty familiar with. Does that sound like a familiar task to most of us? Okay. So simplifying, I just mean adding, subtracting, multiplying, or dividing some algebraic terms. I'm going to write one down. So I would say like basic math facts, like how you add, subtract, multiply, or divide a negative, or how you would add, subtract, multiply, or divide a fraction, are things that you would have at least spent a little bit of time reviewing in your Algebra 1 course, and are things that I would hope that we're reasonably comfortable with doing now. I will do a little bit of discussion about dealing with fractions, because I want to give you a little bit more general approach on how to deal with adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing fractions. Not because the shortcuts that you've probably learned in middle elementary through your Algebra 1 course aren't good methods, but rather because this more general method that I'm going to show you, we can attach to, or becomes the foundation of, some later skills in this course, where if I think about fractions this way, it becomes like a natural precursor or natural introduction to another topic later on that tends to be rather difficult. And if I can connect it to something that we're a little bit more familiar with, typically it goes a little bit better for students. So I will spend a little bit of time here early on talking about how we do these basic 4 operations with fractions. And probably I'm going to do it in a way that you're like, this seems like way more work than what you showed me, or what my teacher showed me in middle school. And they're probably true. I assure you that we are still doing the same thing. And I assure you that if you will accept that this might seem like a little bit more work right now, it will pay off greatly later on when things become much more complicated. Because your shortcuts that you learned in elementary school or middle school fall apart rather quickly. So we will do a little bit of that early on, and that might actually be the first thing we start with, just as a topic that we should at least feel relatively comfortable with. I haven't quite decided though. Does anyone else? Can anyone else think of a obvious Algebra 1 topic that we're missing? And I can't really either. So this feels like a probably pretty representative sample of an average Algebra 1 experience. Now, if you see a couple of things on here that you're like, yeah, I'm not sure I know what that is, or I don't think I did that, that's okay. Maybe. If they were the quadratic related stuff, like if you didn't spend a lot of time factoring or solving quadratics, that's okay. We will redo all of that this year. Or if you're not super familiar with solving absolute values, we'll spend some time solving absolute value this year. So let's talk about then this year what we're planning on doing. So the first thing that we're going to talk about are functions. So some of us probably recognize this term from their Algebra 1 course, or specifically function notation, where we wrote f of x's instead of y's on occasion. Right? F of x equals instead of y equals. That should be familiar to most of us. We'll talk more broadly about what the definition of a function is again. This is something that I think gets underemphasized in most Algebra 1 courses. And then talk about some ways to describe functions and ways to represent functions and some properties therein of functions. So we'll spend most of the first unit will be kind of a discussion of functions in general. From there, we're going to talk about then different types of function groups for the remainder of the course, both in first and second semester. So we'll talk about absolute value functions. We'll talk about quadratic functions. And then more broadly, we'll talk about polynomial functions. We'll talk about radical functions. And those aren't functions that are surfing. That's a joke. They're functions that involve like a square root or a cube root. Most of us, I think, are familiar with square roots. You probably did a fair amount of that in geometry when dealing with the Pythagorean theorem. Some of us may be familiar with cube roots and have seen that or used a cube root on occasion before. Not an expectation you'd remember anything about cube roots coming into this course, but some of us might recognize that. Inside of these radical function, we'll also talk about inverse functions in general. We'll probably do a little bit of that, though, when we talk about functions also. We'll talk about rational functions. A rational function is just something that has a variable in both the numerator and or denominator. So like x plus 5 over x minus 6 is a rational function. So we'll talk about those. We'll talk about exponential functions. And also alongside with that, logarithmic functions. I'd expect that a handful of us remember talking about exponential functions briefly in their Algebra 1 course. I would assume that not many of us do. I think that's a little bit of a rare Algebra 1 topic that you get that far, in particular if you took Algebra 1 as an 8th grader, where the course is a little bit shorter than it would be as a high school student. Because typically the 8th graders end up leaving a little bit earlier. So But if you took the Algebra 1 course as a high school student, you probably saw something about exponential functions, or at least that sounds kind of familiar. This is kind of the function part of the course. For all of these different function groups, we're going to be concerned with primarily these three skills. We want to be able to graph these functions. We want to be able to simplify expressions containing these functions. And then we want to be able to solve equations involving these functions. So for each of these 7 topics here, the primary 3 skills we're going to worry about are graphing, simplifying, and solving. Now, it's the process or the detail inside of each of these skills will change a little bit depending on the function type. I'm going to try to do things as generally as possible. So I'm going to try to teach these things and think about these topics in ways that it's going to still be applicable in the next chapter, in the next topic, and the next topic, and the next topic, as much as I can, but there are some fundamental differences between these things that are, like you kind of can't get around. But in general, these are the 3 kinds of problems that you would see inside of all of these different topics. If time permits, the next things we would talk about are sequences and series. Usually we can get into that, and then after that would be some basic statistics stuff. It's a little bit rare for this course to get to the statistics part. Just a quick show of hands, how many of us are juniors in this course? So, half or more. Those of you that are juniors will likely be taking the ACT at least once during the course of this year. The math portions of the ACT contain a lot of material that would be covered in this course. So if you're taking an ACT in the fall, just be a little bit wary of that there's going to be some topics there that you will not have seen that would be you'll see in this course. Maybe worth thinking about trying to take a second go around in the spring or summer after you've completed this course and are a little bit more familiar with all of the content here. I will do a little bit inside of this first functions chapter using your calculator and show you some techniques that you can use to solve some equations that even if you're not familiar with the function type that it's asking for, you still can potentially get an answer for a multiple choice test like an ACT. So again, make sure you have your graphing calculator kind of beginning of next week. When we do that, it'll, especially for you guys that are juniors taking an ACT this fall, that'll be a really useful day where we spend kind of working with our calculator and getting you guys familiar with how to use your calculator to solve things that you don't know how to solve algebraically by hand. That your calculator can do a lot of that heavy lifting for you if you know how to ask it to. So we'll spend some time early on doing that, specifically for you guys that are juniors taking an ACT this fall. I think it'll be a helpful skill to have, and maybe you can answer 2 or 3 additional questions that you couldn't have otherwise. Questions about this course setup or what to kind of expect here?